The wind moaned through the narrow alleys of the village, but inside the cottage, silence held dominion. Time slowed. It did not pass like a stream or drift like snow. It hung like frost in the lungs, sharp and unmoving. The woman did not speak. Words felt too expensive, too heavy to lift from her tongue. Her eyes wandered instead, tracing the low-slung rafters where cobwebs clung like forgotten prayers. A single icicle dripped from the inside of the roof beam, one drop every minute. A rhythm that echoed like a funeral bell in the stillness. Each sound was magnified. The faint creak of timber, shifting a dog's body against the straw. The rustle of cloth as the child stirred and whimpered and was soothed again with a gentle hum that was less melody and more breath. She rocked slightly, back and forth, not in comfort, but in rhythm, a metronome of endurance. Outside, the snow deepened, not inches or feet, but presence. It pressed against the walls, the doors, the soul. It erased paths, buried fences, swallowed landmarks. In the minds of the villagers, the world beyond the village ceased to exist, smothered in a white that carried no mercy. In seasons like these, people vanished. Not in blood or screams, but in stillness. They lay down, closed their eyes, and simply did not rise. But the woman would not vanish. She could not. She had something left to burn. The child's warmth was small, but it tethered her. Every breath the infant drew summoned one more from her lungs. Every whimper brought her back from the edge. The ache in her back, the weight of the cloak, the dull throb in her joints. These were the signs that she was still in the world of the living. Pain meant presence. Hunger meant hope. In the corner of the room, a mouse scurried, pawing at a bit of stale oat. She watched it with a strange tenderness. It too was surviving in its own small defiance. She whispered toward it. Not words, just a thread of sound, as though speaking would tie them together. They were both winter creatures now, both huddled in forgotten spaces, hoping for the thaw. A gust rattled the door and made the wall shiver. Snow blew in through a crack in the frame, dusting the edge of the threshold like ash. The woman didn't move. She merely pulled her child closer and adjusted the wool at her feet, tucking it in with fingers stiff as old branches. Movement was risky. Movement was heat lost, and still. She waited for the man who might return. His name lingered at the edge of her thoughts, not spoken aloud for fear it would vanish into the cold. She imagined him moving through the storm, head bowed, shoulders hunched, eyes squinting against the wind. She saw him knocking on doors, offering what little they had: a copper clasp, a worn-out comb, a carved spoon from his childhood, anything. For a bundle of roots, a scrap of hay, a candle's stub. He had left before the snowfall grew thick, when the sky still held color, and the air still whispered of thaw. Now he was a question hung in the wind. His absence was a weight she carried in silence. She had dreamed of him last night, standing barefoot in a field of green, his arms full of apples. Not winter apples, but the kind from long ago summers. Warm, sweet, impossible. He had smiled in the dream, and for a moment her body had forgotten the cold. But then she woke, and the frost on the wall had crept further down, reaching toward the floor like fingers. She breathed in again. The air inside the cottage was dense with memories. Burnt peat, boiled nettle, her mother's voice humming lullabies. From a time when winters were shorter and fear was simpler. Those days were gone. Now the walls sagged, the floor sloped, and the hearth held only stones, black with soot, cold as bones. Still, she whispered the old symbols, a spiral drawn in. Frost, a cross with no edges, a crescent shaped like the moon that hadn't been seen in weeks. Her grandmother once told her these shapes held power, not because of what they were, but because of who remembered them. In the frost she drew them again, not for magic, for memory. For defiance, the baby stirred, its small fingers opening, like petals in sleep. And in that motion, Something stirred in her too. She looked toward the door, half expecting a knock. But none came. Only the sound of the wind howling past, dragging with it 1,000 lost voices, voices of other mothers, other winters, other children who had not survived. She closed her eyes and imagined fire. Not the greedy flame of a new log, but the soft, patient heat of embers, the kind that linger long after the blaze has died. She imagined her body as one of those embers, not blazing, but refusing to go dark. She shifted slightly, laying the baby against her chest. Her heartbeat was slow, but steady. Outside, the crow cried again, the same one or another, she could not tell. The sound echoed in white, a note of life in a world of silence. And then, footsteps, faint, but real. Snow compressed under weight. Measured, careful, human. She did not move, did not allow hope to flare too quickly. The dogs lifted their heads, but did not bark. Even they understood the weight of silence. A pause at the door, a hand on the latch. And then it opened. Wind rushed in like a ghost, and behind it, a shadow. Hunched with cold, arms burdened with bundles wrapped in cloth and string, eyes wide with exhaustion. Lips cracked but smiling, he had returned, not a lot but something, a bag of roots, a pinch of oats, straw tied with twine. And in his coat, 2 stolen apples, shriveled, bruised, but whole. She did not speak. He did not need her to. They merely looked at one another, their eyes holding what words could not carry. Grief, joy, fatigue, love, all bound by frost and breath. He knelt beside them and reached for the child. His fingers were trembling, but the warmth had already begun to rise again. Outside, the wind still wailed, but inside, a new silence formed. Not death, but survival. Not of waiting, but of return. The fire was still only memory. But hope, this fragile, stubborn ember, was alive. Carried not by kindling, but by hands. By hunger, by heart. As night fell, the snow thickened. And somewhere beyond the village, in the woods not yet thawed, something else was stirring. Wolves, perhaps. Or worse. But in this house of frost and prayer, the flame had not died, and tomorrow would ask more. A bell rang in the distant abbey, dull, half swallowed by snow and time. Its toll came not as sound, but as tremor, a low pulse rolling through fog-slick fields where the land itself seemed to hold its breath. There, amid frost-bitten furrows and the brittle remnants of last season's harvest, men moved like shadows. Against the morning, they did not speak. They did not sing. They knelt with reverence and dread, fingers stiff as antlers, scrabbling beneath the frozen crust for what little the earth had not yet reclaimed. Frost clung to their beards like filings from some ancient blade. Their breath rose in slow exhalations, gray ghosts spiraling skyward, dissolving in the hush. One among them worked slower than the others, not from weakness but ritual. His back was bowed, not from age alone, but from decades of obedience to soil, to silence, to the cruel mathematics of survival. He wore no cloak, only coarse wool patched with memories, scraps of past winters, past wars, past hunger. His hands, cracked and knotted, moved like tools honed by a lifetime of frost. Turnip surfaced, gnarled and stunted. He cradled it briefly, its pale skin already going softer on the stem, then tucked it beneath his tunic, pressing it against his chest like a relic. It would feed 2 mouths, maybe 3, if boiled with herbs and a fistful of stale oats. If not, it would at least quiet the children's crying. The others dug beside him, stooped and silent, each bound by their own private contract with the earth. They did not waste words. Talking in the fields was to waste warmth. And besides, there were things in winter older than language: hunger, death, waiting. These things preferred quiet. The men moved in rhythm, shoulder to shoulder, breath against breath. Their closeness was not fellowship, but necessity. When the sun finally broke the fog, it did not warm. It only revealed glistening frost, worn boots, skin like bark. They rose slowly, their limbs aching with the heaviness of the living, and made their way home. The older man's hut sat low in the hillside, half buried, as if the land itself had tried to swallow it. Its roof was moss-grown, its door hung on leather loops, its chimney long abandoned. Inside, the dark was breath-warm. There was no fire. There had been no fire in weeks, not for lack of trying, but for lack of right to waste wood on anything that could be endured. Fire was for smiths, for lords, for the abbey that rang its bell while the peasants bent their backs beneath it. Here, fire was in memory. Instead, heat came from what still lived. Goats huddled in one corner, chickens rustled in the straw. His sons slept beneath a thatch of rugs and sacking, their limbs curled tight, their breath rising in thin, rhythmic clouds. A wife had once lain among them, but the fever had taken her 2 winters ago. He had not remarried. He had simply learned to listen more closely to the creak of timbers, to the soft cluck of hens, to the dreams of children murmured in sleep. Beneath the straw floor, dung smoldered buried deep, layered thick, its slow heat drawn upward by instinct and inheritance. His grandfather had done it. His father, too. A quiet magic, passed from calloused hand to calloused hand, never written, never spoken. A small icon rested in the corner, St. Cuthbert, the silent one. The man's wife had carved it from applewood during her final autumn. Now, a single feather lay atop it, white and downy, as if a bird had come in the night and left behind a whisper. He did not light a candle. To light a flame was to invite its death. Instead, he sat and breathed with the others. That was enough. The hut was more than shelter. It was a pact in prayer. The walls held heat because he asked a few of them. The straw gave warmth because he layered it with care. The earth gave roots because he bowed to its silence. He understood what many had forgotten, that to live in winter was not to conquer it, but to become part of its stillness. He lay down, wrapping his arms around the sack that held today's yield: parsnips, a few turnips, some bitter wild leaves, enough to keep death waiting another day. And in that dark, with no fire but the breath of beasts and boys, he closed his eyes. Not in sleep, but listening, to the earth beneath him, to the wind outside, to the bell, still tolling faintly across the fields like a distant promise no longer meant for men like him. Winter did not speak in storms. It spoke in hush, in stillness, in the long pause between one breath and the next. Tomorrow he will rise. Again before the light. He would walk the same frost-bitten path. He would press his fingers into the same unyielding soil, because that is what it meant to endure, not to overcome, but to continue. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in the snow-drowned roads where pilgrims wandered and war horses once passed, a new shadow moved, hooves crunching ice, a banner folded beneath a cloak, a name returning to the mouths of peasants. For now, here in this breath-warm dark, the old man slept, and winter listened. The river had frozen solid by the feast of Epiphany. It no longer moved. It held its breath beneath a skin of ancient glass, silvered and splintered like a holy mirror, each crack a remembrance of motion long ceased. Skates had once scarred its surface, iron-bound hooves had struck it at dawn, and monks with buckets had walked its edges wrapped in silence. Now it was still frozen mid-prayer. Even the sun, pale and spectral, dared only to glance across its surface. Along its banks lay the village half-buried, half-waiting. Snow pressed into every crevice, hushing the outlines of homes until they seemed more memory than place. Roofs bowed beneath the weight of January, as though the houses themselves had entered penance. Chimneys stood as mute spires, no longer exhaling, only watching. At the edge of the forest, where the trees loomed tall and white-laced like monks in mourning, a narrow cottage clung to the land like a secret. Inside it, breath rose in clouds, thin, steady, alive. A girl stood at the window. Her breath fogged the glass, but she didn't wipe it away. She pressed her ear to the pane, listening, not for visitors, not for wolves, not even for her father's return, but for the creak of trees bowing to ice. That sound, when it arrived, was like the breaking of bones underwater, deep, distant, inevitable. It told her the forest was still holding, that it had not yet fallen. Her hands were wrapped in woolen cords, knotted tightly against the cold. Her sleeves were padded with hay, her brother's idea. Better to wear the field than lie in it, he'd said. She had smiled then, the way one smiles not because something is funny, but because the cold demands an answer. There was no fire. There had been no fire since the cradle went. 2 nights ago, they burned it, carefully, reverently, as though it were a body. The bench had gone first. Then the small chest, the one that had once held their mother's wedding veil. Now the hearth was hollow, a wound in the wall. The ashes had been sifted and reused, mixed with snow to patch a broken sill. Still, they endured. The girl stirred a thin soup, oats, water, 3 coins of preserved garlic, no more. The pot barely steamed, but the act of stirring gave her hands purpose. Across the room, her brother knelt beneath the great ox hide, stitched in long winters past by a grandmother they barely remembered. He curled into himself, lips moving in quiet recitations, stories of saints who lay in the snow for 7 days and rose with holy breath. Stories of winters survived by those who had only prayer and patience. Their mother sat near the wall, weaving rushes with cracked fingers. Her motions were slow but exact, each braid twisted like a spell against time. She had not spoken since morning. Speech was saved for blessings and instructions. Silence preserved warmth. Words were spent like embers. The wind rattled the door. But it did not enter. The windows had been stuffed with cloth, the gaps sealed with salt-rubbed hides. A jar of goose fat stood by the door untouched except at night, when it was rubbed into their feet, into the cuts at the corners of their mouths. It smelled of meat, better days, something close to love. Outside, an owl called once low, round, and final dot, then it vanished into the white. No wing beat, no shadow, just absence. The girl turned from the window and lit a candle, not for light, not for heat, just to prove she could. The flame stuttered, tiny and brave. It danced for seconds, no more. But in that small moment, its warmth reached her cheek, and she smiled. Fire was a luxury, but warmth was something else. It could be summoned from breath, from memory, from stories spoken between blankets when the walls seemed to shiver. Warmth could come from ritual, a hand placed on a forehead, a story whispered into sleep, a prayer scratched into frost on the window. It was something they could still give each other, something that could not be taken by cold or hunger or time. Later, they huddled together beneath the ox hide. The soup was gone, the pot scraped clean. Their mother sang a song in the old tongue, voice barely above a hum. The girl did not understand the words, but she knew their meaning. They were not songs of spring or hope or salvation. They were songs of enduring, of lasting just long enough, of sleeping close and waking still breathing, of believing that beneath the frozen river the current still moved, that under all this snow something green waited. The candle had long since died, but their breaths still rose, one after another, like stars pressed into the night. Outside, a new sound came, faint, metallic. Hoofbeats on frozen ground. Not near. Not yet, but coming. A rider in the distance. A banner beneath their cloak. A name whispered through villages like a promise, or a reckoning. And within the cottage, no one spoke. They only breathed and waited, wrapped in silence. Wrapped in one another, wrapped in the ancient knowledge that winter, too, was a kind of passing. And soon, something would stir. A woolen curtain hung stiff with ice between 2 rooms, its fringe kissed by frost, its folds barely moving, just as slow, spectral sway with each breath of wind that slithered beneath the warped doorframe. Beyond it, silence. Pressed close. A silence not of peace, but of presence thick and watchful, broken only by the creak of timber in the rafters and the soft, patient rhythm of wooden prayer beads slipping through an old woman's fingers. She sat facing away from the hearth. There was no fire to greet her, no glow to soften the dark. Only a cold pit where ash and memory gathered, and above it, an iron kettle, suspended still, half filled with water gone brackish and still steeping dried linden blossoms. The air held no warmth, but she stirred the tea with a spoon carved by a hand now gone. She stirred because ritual still mattered, because some things, some motions, some hymns must not be abandoned. Even when warmth is gone. She whispered the psalms from memory, words dry as seed husks, falling into air that did not carry them far. Still they rose, toward the beams, where icicles clung like teeth, toward heaven, if heaven still listened to frostbitten lips. Her mantle was lined with fur, not from luxury, but foresight. She had stitched it herself in another winter, a season of famine and burying, when cloth was salvation. Now she wore it not for herself alone, but for those breathing softly in the room beyond the curtain. Daughters, their children entangled like vines for heat, their limbs a tapestry of endurance. Each breath they exhaled wove steam into the straw-stuffed cloth that wrapped their bodies, not blankets, but relics passed from shoulder to shoulder. Year to year, the children did not cry in the night anymore. Even toddlers had learned not to waste heat in their lungs. She did not weep for them. There was no need. They were not dying. They were learning what it meant to survive in silence. Her son had not returned, and yet she did not curse him. Not aloud. Not in the chambers of her heart. He was a good boy, full grown now, but still with the same eyes that once blinked up at her beneath a summer sun. He had gone out for wood 4 days past into the forest where the trees stood like penitents, where wolves did not bark but watched. He would return, or he would not. The cold did not care. She adjusted the kettle, though it had no flame beneath it. It was not for drinking, it was for hoping. The scent of linden still hovered faintly in the air, a ghost of gentler seasons, of her mother's hands, of rooms with laughter. By her side sat a candle stub. She did not light it. Its wax had been remelted and reformed so many times that it no longer remembered its first flame. But it still waited, as she did. Waiting was also a kind of warmth. Outside, the wind shifted, dragging a veil of snow across the door. It moaned once low and long, as though the land itself were grieving. Then came the sound she'd known would come. A bell, distant, hollow, the bell for Prime, rung by hands she would never see, summoning monks from their pallets to murmur Latin into frigid stone. The sound passed through the frost like fingers over a shroud. Not sharp, but softened, mournful, holy. She closed her eyes, not to sleep. Sleep would not come easily now, but to listen, to join the silence, to blend into the stillness that held the roof aloft, silence that held her family in breathless prayer. Stillness, silence, and survival. These had long since ceased to be separate things. They had braided themselves into one, a single rope, cold and sacred, upon which she had suspended her life. In that braid, she rested, and in resting, kept them warm. Above her, the roof groaned gently beneath the weight of snow. Outside, the dawn began to stir, not with light, but with awareness. In a nearby town, a cart rolled over frozen ground, its wheels carved with ash, its cargo covered with canvas and straw. Inside that cart, something shivered, not with cold, with breath. A figure cloaked in dark wool, shoulders stiff with purpose, eyes set on the distant hills where smoke no longer rose. And back in the cottage, the old woman whispered one last psalm, not to God, but to the cold itself, a final offering, a wordless pact. Stay your hand. Let the children see the thaw. Then she leaned her head to the side, still holding her beads, still listening, still enduring, because this too was love. The frost had crept over the fields like a ghost in the night. It left no tracks, no sound, only a soft possession of the land-whitening barley stubble, threading its thin fingers through the hedgerows, laying a hush across cart ruts, animal prints, and the broken fence posts of forgotten seasons. Everything it touched turned brittle. Even the breath of the living in the outer holdings of the manor. Long before the sun dared rise, the peasants gathered. Not for orders, not for warmth, but for habit. They stood around the cold stone oven at the edge of the commons, the one that had once baked barley loaves for 10 households. It was hollow now. Its stones are silent, suitless, and aching with disuse. But they gathered all the same, drawn by memory's gravity. They huddled shoulder to shoulder, faces lined not by age but by hunger, hands wrapped in straw and old linen. Words were few. There was nothing left to explain. Only breath clouded. Ragged, shared. Sometimes one would place a hand on the old oven's stone, as though to summon ghosts of heat, of baking bread, of feast days now vanished beneath the frost. Among them stood a boy, 12 winters old. Maybe less. There was no counting here, not anymore. He did not speak, but his eyes dark and wide moved, like they were tracing a map no one else could see. He watched the elders, how they tucked straw into the gaps of their boots, how they turned their backs to the wind as if hiding secrets in their coats, how they passed a wool scarf from one neck to another without needing to ask. His tunic was too short for his height, but it had been patched with care scraps of fox fur, stitched in crooked lines, a tail still sewn to the hem. His mother had trapped the animal last spring. It died quickly, she said. He had not asked what quickly meant. That morning, the boy carried something precious. Not food, not a coin, but a spark, nestled in a clay pot, wrapped in dried moss and bark curls. One ember, still breathing, still red. He had taken it from the blacksmith's forge the night before, just before the fire died for good. The blacksmith had seen him, said nothing, only nodded once. The pot hung from a leather cord at his waist. It clinked softly with every step. Like the bell of a shrine no longer visited, he walked slowly, deliberately, not out of fear, but out of reverence. He did not run. To run was to risk jostling the ember into silence. To run was to fail. His cottage stood near the edge of the wood, where the branches leaned low with snow and the wind carried the scent of pine and rot. The roof sagged in the middle, but it still held. The walls wept with cold frost feathering. The interior like lace, dripping quietly onto the packed earth floor. But they were waiting for him, his sisters, 2 of them, bundled in wool and straw, one rocking the baby beneath an old deer skin. The dog, ribs showing, curled tightly around. Their feet, a guardian of warmth. Their mother crouched near the hearth, where only ash and memory had lived for a fortnight. She looked at him and said nothing, only held out her hand. The boy gave her the pot. Her fingers trembled not with fear, but with reverence. She peeled back the moss. The ember still glowed small, but alive. A secret sun, a flicker of yesterday's fire, saved to birth tomorrow. She lit a reed. Hold it close, waited. Reed smoked, caught, then held. She lowered it into the hollow of a brick. Firebox, carefully packed with ash, dried dung, and patience. There was a long moment. The kind of moment that breaks in 2 before and after, then a flame, small, thin, but it held. No one cheered. This was not a triumph. It was a return. They gathered close, bodies ringed like stones around a shrine. The flame whispered soft, as breath, not a blaze, not a roar, just a murmur. Enough to warm broth, enough to dry one sock, enough to kiss a sleeping child's cheek and not find it frozen. They did not speak. They simply sat close, passing a single bowl of water slowly warming above the flame. And in that silence, something sacred returned. Not comfort, not safe, but continuity. The ember had crossed the fields. It had survived the wind. It had not gone out. That was enough. Outside, the frost deepened its grip, crawling higher up the walls, frosting the edges of glassless windows. But inside, a thread had been pulled back through the eye of the storm. One spark, one breath. One boy with raw hands and a fur-hemmed tunic, carrying fire through a frozen world. And far off, on the road beyond the manor, hoofbeats stirred. A rider passed beneath the bare trees, cloak snapping in the wind, a satchel heavy with parchment, with ink, with a seal not yet broken, a message, a name, a change. But in the cottage by the woods, the flame crackled gently. And for one night more, they were still here. Snow had buried the chapel roof by morning. Not fallen buried. A thick white veil pulled slowly over its slanted bones, softening the hard edges of stone, blurring corners once chiseled by pious hands. The bell tower stood like a ghost tall, still, cloaked in mist. Its iron tongue had not spoken in days. Frost had welded it silent. What prayers rose from this place, rose wordless. In the cloister garden, the world was hushed to a breath. Only one path marred the snow, a narrow trail of footprints weaving from dormitory to refectory, then back again. The prints were deep, close together, deliberate, as if someone had walked not with urgency, but with purpose, as if the act of walking was a kind of devotion. Brother Matthew walked that path before dawn. He moved slowly through the corridors, his rough-spun habit, dark with frost at the hem, a borrowed wolfskin draped over his shoulders, not for warmth, but for weight. The weight reminded him the world still touches his back. His breath came in small clouds, echoing off cold stone like incense from the lungs. The braziers were empty. They had not been lit in a week. By order of the abbess, they would remain. So penance by cold. Reflection in silence. It was said their sins would freeze before they could rise to heaven. It was said that discipline endured in winter bore fruit in the soul. Matthew did not protest. He carried his candle, small and flickering, a fragile sun cradled in a cupped hand. He did not speak unless spoken to, but still he moved. Still he served. In the infirmary, the air bit through the mortar. The sick lay swaddled in every rag the monastery could offer, old habits, unused altar cloths, remnants of pilgrim cloaks forgotten by the door. Each bed was a small shrine of breath. One nun moaned as if caught in some dream of fire. Another clutched a crucifix so tightly her fingers had bruised. Matthew approached without words. Words, in this place, were currency spent too quickly. He knelt beside them. He pressed snowmalt to their foreheads with a linen scrap, cooling their fevers with the same hand he'd once used to grind grain and lift incense. His fingers trembled, but whether cold or reverent, he did not say. There was no fire, but there was still motion. There was still touch. In his voice, he offered warmth. In his silence, he offered presence. When his tasks were done, he returned to his cell. The candle had burned low, leaving a stub he would stretch into tomorrow. He removed his sandals and slid them beneath the straw mattress, not for hiding, but for heat. He would rest his hands upon them as he slept, so that flesh might greet leather with something like memory. Beneath his robe, a stone pressed against his chest, polished smooth, dark with age. It had once sat beside the altar, warmed by a votive flame that had since gone out. He carried it now as others carried relics, not for the stone's holiness, but for the weight of what it had once known. He lay down slowly. The walls whispered as he moved, cracks in the mortar shifting with breath. As if the monastery itself still prayed in its sleep, Matthew whispered too. Psalms low and steady, barely more than a tremor in the air. Each verse rose in a cloud before his face, then faded like footsteps across a frozen lake. He did not seek comfort, Comfort was the language of flesh. He sought remembrance. The cold entered his bones like a teacher, sharp, watchful, exacting. But it did not conquer him, it refined him. Shaped the edges of thought, hollowed space for something quieter to enter. He did not ask when spring would come. That question belonged to the world, beyond the cloister walls, to villagers who counted days by the warmth of the sun and the swelling of seeds. Here, the measure was different. Stillness became warmth. Breath became sacred. Endurance became prayer. In the hush of the abbey, where frost rhymed the windows like lace spun by angels, the absence of fire became its own kind of light. And outside, beneath the snow, the earth turned slowly, silently, its own rhythm undisturbed. Somewhere in the valley below, a figure approached on foot, a messenger with frost in his beard and parchment in his breast, bearing a seal, bearing news. But Brother Matthew slept now, hands folded, stone to heart, wrapped in linen and silence. And through the long corridor of cold, he dreamed not of warmth, but of endurance that did not break. The wind came like a beast that night, howling from the moors with a hunger in its throat. It bent the trees to its will, peeled bark from trunks, rattled the shutters of the old mill with fingers made of frost and fury. The thatch groaned under the weight of damp, blackened straw. Moss bloomed in corners where sun once warmed. Timber, below, the river lay silenced. Once it had sung against the mill wheel, a voice of motion, of grain, of bread becoming life. Now it was still, held beneath a veil of glassy ice, too thin to bear weight, too thick to break. A river in winter is not dead, but it waits. Inside the mill, time held its breath. The air was thick with flour dust, not the kind that signals labor, but the kind that settles from stillness. The scent of old wool, of dried herbs long forgotten in a beam's shadow, clung to everything. It was not warm, but it was a memory. 3 generations shared that silence. The grindstone had not turned in weeks. No grain had passed through its teeth. No sacks had been filled, but the sacks still hung swaying gently above their heads, casting slow, trembling shadows like ghosts of labor left undone. Beneath them, mice ruled. They darted between rafters and floorboards, a tiny kingdom rising in the absence of men. They gnawed what was left. They did not ask permission. The family had not burned the sacks, nor the bench, nor the barrel hoops. Some things were sacred, not for worship, but for what they promised. Spring, work, a return. To burn them would be to admit that the wheel would never turn again. So they endured. The girl's 7 winters, maybe 8, lay beneath an upturned grain barrel, turned into a kind of shelter, a womb of straw and felted wool. She had lined it with bits of torn cloak, woven straw between the slats like a nest. Her breath warmed the small space. It held barely. Beside her, her grandmother beat a spoon against an empty pot, rhythmic, soft, a metal and silence-shaped lullaby. She told stories as she beat, of frost giants with breath like blizzards, of saints who slept in snow for 7 nights and rose shining. The girl listened with wide eyes, not to believe, but to belong. The stories were not true. They were rituals. And rituals warmed in ways fire could not. The father sat with his back to the door, a knife in his lap. He did not sharpen it for use. There was nothing to cut. But the act, the familiar scrape of stone on edge, gave him the illusion of readiness. As if courage could be whetted like steel, his eyes never left the window. He watched the wind trace patterns in the frost. He watched the moon rise slowly and cold. When night came fully, they prepared the stones. Flat, heavy ones taken from beneath the oven's crumbled lip. They buried them in the few remaining embers, then wrapped them in cloth, tucked them beneath the bedding as if planting something precious. They curled around them, child-mother, grandmother, as though the earth might remember warmth if only reminded by flesh. They did not speak. Not because there was nothing to say, but because silence had become a language, Every gesture was measured. Every movement is sacred. The way the grandmother tucked the cloth at the child's neck. The way the father placed his hand near the floorboards, feeling for warmth not with his fingers, but with hope, through a narrow crack in the shutter. The moon carved a line across the floor, thin, sharp, a blade of silver slicing the dark. The girl saw it. She reached out, slowly, carefully, her hand wrapped in rags too worn to name. She touched the beam of light as if it might respond. Her fingers hovered there, not trembling. Not afraid. She had learned something the others had long known. That cold was not the enemy, it was the test, the watcher. The keeper of the old names, the names whispered before sleep, before warmth, before the fire. She lay back beneath her canopy. The mice above moved gently. The stories faded. The knife lay still, and in the quiet mill, beneath the sacks beside the river that waited for thaw, the family did not sleep. They endured. And far downstream, where the ice cracked softly beneath the moonlight, something shifted. A sound too faint to name. A thaw, or a step, or the first cry of something waking beneath the snow. And the girl, eyes wide beneath her barrel, shelter, listened. The stained glass was no longer whole. Its saints were shattered, their faces lost in shards of sapphire and wine. But still, they watched. Fragments of color caught the moonlight as it slipped through the broken roof, casting ghostly halos on the nave floor, where straw met stone and people huddled close-breathed, not in fear, but in quiet defiance. The ruin had once rung with bells and psalms. Now it rang only with silence. A silence thick enough to feel in the bones. Outside, in the forest beyond the crypt wall, the soldiers searched, boots cracking ice. Voices low, sharp, cruel. The villagers heard them. But they did not run. They had come here not to hide, but to remember what it meant to gather without chains. A woman, nursing her child in the dark, moved only by instinct. Her body remembered what the world had tried to make her forget, that warmth was not given by kings but by closeness, by the thrum of a heartbeat beneath skin. Her shawl, once bright with festival dye, had dulled to ashen frost. Still, she wrapped it tighter, its edges frayed but unyielding. Across from her, a boy sat curled beneath the remnants of a tapestry, its threads unraveled by time and rain. At his neck hung a bell, small, iron, rust-bitten, taken from the chapel's ruined door. It made no sound. It must make no sound. Not yet. His fingers closed around it when the wind changed, when branches snapped beyond the wall, when his father stilled beside him like a hunted deer. But the boy did not cry. He pressed the bell to his chest as if its silence could shield him. They slept in stacks, not from comfort, but from ritual. A mother's back to the door, a child between legs. A sick uncle pressed to a warm flank like a lamb in a storm. Straw, cloak, skin, layered and interlocked. Their bodies formed a hive, fragile but alive. Some lay atop gravestones, names erased by weather and war. Others curled beside what had been the altar, where the stone cracked like old bread and the ivy wound upward, reaching for what once was divine. An old man, blind since childhood, ran his fingers across that altar. He did not need eyes. His memory was clearer than moonshine. He whispered the credo, half formed, half felt, as his hands traced the worn grooves where chalices once stood, where priests once wept. He did not cry. His tears had dried long ago, but still he whispered, et in terra pax. No fire burned, the cold pressed in like a breath held too long. But none dared spark a flame, not here, not now. A single ember could summon the wrong eyes. Instead, they pressed together. Flesh against flesh, fear wrapped in silence. Above them, snow fell not in flurries, but slow, reverent flakes like blessings forgotten. It sifted through the open roof, dusting the nave in white, dusting the old psalters, the broken pews, the bowed heads, The air smelled of earth and wool and breath. No incense, no myrrh. But something sacred still clung here. The mother rocked slightly, her child drifting into sleep. The boy with the bell closed his eyes, thumb resting on the tongue of silence. The blind man smiled as the prayer ended without words. And somewhere in the apse, beneath a slanted beam, a candle stub still sat half-melted, long extinguished. But not forgotten. They did not light it, but they remembered. And when the wind rose again, tearing through the woods, echoing through the chapel's broken bones, not one of them moved. They had learned the shape of stillness, not surrender, not despair. Readiness. For fire would return. And when it did, when the bell finally rang, when the embers were stirred again into light, this moment would remain, the moment they endured in the house of broken saints. Not because they were strong, but because they stayed. In the ruin, in the hush, in the breath between winter and deliverance, they waited. Not for warmth, but for what would come after. The wind struck first, not as sound, but as pressure. A weight that leaned into the stones, testing their resolve. Then came the howl, long and low, threading through the cracks in the sod roof, like a whisper too ancient to name. The hut stood alone on the high moor, half buried in snow, its door swollen with moisture, latched only by a leather thong and a prayer whispered through chapped lips. Inside, the air was thick with life, the wet musk of wool and dung, of animal breath and skin. A sheep sneezed, and the girl stirred, but did not lift her head. Her arms wrapped tightly around the away, her cheek pressed to its side, where warmth pulsed steady and deep. She did not cry. She had learned it early that tears were too warm to waste. Her father lay nearby, his back against the curved stone wall, his limbs drawn inward like a monk at vigil. His breath came slow, his cloak dusted with rime, his knife bare in the straw beside him. He would not speak unless he must. Silence was a covenant here, between man and beast, between breath and storm. The sheep shifted gently in their slumber, their bodies packed close, a living fortress against the cold. The girl counted their hearts, felt them in the floor, in her ribs, in her teeth. She sang soft, tuneless, barely a whisper, not for comfort, for rhythm, for memory, a lullaby without words, passed down from hands that spun flax, that baked barley in stone ovens, that buried children and lit candles and knew how to wait. Her fingers moved slowly through the beads of her rosary, berries, now dried to husks, and small bones from a rabbit long gone. Each bead a name, a winter, a promise. Outside, the snow fell not in flurries but in sheets, a slow, relentless descent that buried everything it touched. The sheep breathed in unison. Their warmth rose like smoke, thick and holy, curling against the thatch, mixing with the bitter tang of dung smoke from the low fire pit. The coals there did not blaze. They glowed, a faint red smear beneath ash and straw, enough to ward off frostbite, enough to trick the blood into staying. Her father coughed once. Dry bark echoed. Too loudly, he grunted, shifted his weight, and settled again. No words, just the shape of endurance. He had taught her that the cold was not the enemy. Not truly. It did not hate. It did not hunt. It waited. And so must they. Their food was low, a pouch of dried peas, flatbread gone hard, a smear of lard wrapped in linen like treasure. But they ate little. Hunger, her father had said, could be reasoned with. The cold could not. The night stretched on, an endless tunnel without stars. She thought of her grandmother then, who once told her that sheep are wiser than saints. They know when to huddle. They know how to survive. And so the girl pressed closer to the flock, her body half wrapped in straw and fleece, her ears filled with the rhythm of chewing, of breathing, of warmth shared. The hut creaked, the roof sighed, but held. A lamb bleated in its sleep, and the girl placed her hand on its back, feeling the small rise and fall life, fragile and certain, here in the dark. And then, sometime, past the middle of night, the wind shifted. It did not stop, but it eased, as though pausing to consider what still lay alive beneath its weight. The girl did not sleep, but she did not move either. Stillness was a kind of prayer, a quiet offering to the god of frost and the saints of endurance. Above her, the sod roof wept slow drops of melted snow, a sign perhaps that the storm had not won. Not yet. And so she remained, nestled in the breath of beasts, watching the red coals pulse beneath ash, waiting for morning, not with hope, but with practice. This was how the old ones had lived. This was how the world endured, not by fire, but by staying, by knowing, by being still until the wind passed through. And somewhere below the storm, beneath 100 hooves and a single human heart, the earth remembered spring. Icicles hung like blades from the roof of the cloister, each one thin as a finger, clear as glass, sharp as judgment. The sun struck them from the side, casting broken halos across the stone wall, like relics left behind by angels who fled too slowly. Below, in the undercroft, where the stone met earth in damp union, the breath of men rose in slow, white spirals. A liturgy of vapor. They did not speak. They could not. The rule had bound their tongues before the bells ever woke the sky. Silence before God, silence before warmth. It was Lent, and the fire had been banished like a sin confessed too late. The brothers gathered in that low, dim chamber where the mortar wept with the cold and the air stung like nettles. They moved, like shadows against walls, bending over scraps of wool, pressing straw into wooden seams, packing moss into torn boots. Their hands, cracked and gray, worked with a grace born not of comfort, but of devotion. Brother Alred moved among them, a silent steward of quiet suffering. He bore no torch, only a bundle of rushlights bound with twine and hope, unlit, unused. He paused beside each man, tucking cloth beneath collars, binding feet in oiled rags, pressing a hand to his shoulder when the shivering grew too loud. Air cut the lungs with every breath, but none turned back. The rule was clear: penance by cold, sanctification through frost. Above them, in the refectory, lauds began. The choir's voices trickled down through stone in silence, a fractured hymn, thinned by distance and mortar, but still sacred. Alred closed his eyes, listening. The notes drifted down like snow through a ruined roof, each one a ghost of warmth. They were forbidden to name. He could feel the cold now, deep in his ribs, gnawing slow like an old hound refused its supper, but he did not resist it. To suffer without fire was to imitate Christ. To bow beneath winter without complaint was to kneel at the foot of the cross. He believed this, more deeply than he believed in bread, more faithfully than he feared death. When the brothers dispersed, he returned to his cell, no larger than a grave. The walls were slick with condensation, the ceiling low enough to kiss. In the corner, a single relic hung, an iron nail said to be drawn from a splintered beam beneath a Roman sun. He kissed it gently, his lips sticking briefly to the frozen metal, and for that moment, he forgot the pain in his hands, forgot the stin behind his eyes, forgot that his breath had begun to rasp in his sleep. He lay down upon straw, his bed rustling like pages in an old missal, each fold a prayer in itself. 3 tunics, a borrowed cloak, and still his teeth chattered. Like relics shaken in a reliquary, he did not silence them. They were the sound of flesh enduring, and endurance was all that remained. Somewhere above, the bell tolled none, the iron voice of the monastery, speaking into the frozen quiet. He whispered a prayer then, not for warmth, not for rescue, for endurance, that he might last the night, and rise again in the morning to suffer more, that he might shiver, not despair, that he might grow thin, but not bitter, because cold was no enemy. It was a chalice, a slow communion with pain, a disciplined. And as the frost crept across the lintel, as his hands curled like dead leaves beneath the cloak, as the straw whispered secrets in his ears, Brother Alred kept breathing. Each exhale was a psalm, each tremor a genuflection. He believed truly that holiness was forged in absence, that warmth earned through waiting was more sacred than fire taken by ease. Outside, the icicles grew long and leaned toward the earth. Inside, the man did not sleep, but he did not despair. And above it all, beneath the vault of the frozen sky, the monastery held. Waiting, enduring, becoming holy through the frost.